Hello, I'm Miranda Kahn.
And I'm John Bachman. Coming up this hour on Newsmax Now.
All of the passengers on board a derailed Amtrak train are now accounted for, including an 8th victim. What authorities are now saying about their investigation, including the engineer of that train.
And the jury is still out in the fate of the Boston Marathon bomber Johar Tsarnaev. Will his second day of deliberations bring the sentencing phase to a close? And what is the Vatican really trying to say with its new treaty to recognize Palestine, and see why some say this move has little to do with the current pope?
We'll break that down during our Newsmax Now roundtable coming up this hour right here on Newsmax Now. And thank you for staying with us on this Thursday.
Yeah, officials now say the 8th victim has been found on the wreckage of that Amtrak train that crashed just yesterday. Authorities believe that all 243 victims are now accounted for, including the crew members as well. This is the NTSB says the engineer, identified as Brandon Bostian, tried to hit the brakes on that train while it was traveling more than 100 miles per hour. That's twice the speed limit it should have been traveling at that time. Bostian's lawyer tells ABC News that he barely remembers the accident. The engineer's lawyer also says that he was not using his cell phone, nor was he using drugs or alcohol at the time. He was also injured in the crash, but was treated and released from the hospital. He has been interviewed by police, but is not saying too much yet. A Temple University hospital doctor who has been treating people involved in that crash says many of them are still struggling.
They've been through a very traumatic experience, and I think we should let them recover and get better. I know it's very, very difficult for them.
Well, also, more of the dead have been identified, including Rachel Jacobs, the CEO of a Philadelphia-based tech company, and Justin Zemser, a U.S. Naval Academy midshipman.
Despite the ongoing investigation, the finger-pointing has already begun in Washington. Yesterday, a House committee voted to slash Amtrak's funding by more than $260. Democrats criticized $260,000 rather. Democrats criticize the move and say the cuts will only cause greater harm to this nation's struggling infrastructure. House Speaker John Boehner bristled at suggestions that a lack of funding was to blame for the crash.
Listen, you know, they started this yesterday. It's all about funding. It's all about funding. Well, obviously, it's not about funding. The train was going twice the speed limit. Adequate funds were there. No money's been cut from rail safety.
And again, they were talking about $262 million. Want to correct that. He also expressed his condolences to everyone who was affected by this tragedy.
A Minnesota jury has convicted a so-called Right to Die group for helping a woman commit suicide in 2007. The national organization known as the Final Exit Network was charged in connection with the death of a 57-year-old person named Doreen Dunn. She took her own life after years of dealing with chronic pain. Final Exit Network members who participated in her death will face a maximum fine of $33,000. That group will be sentenced in August. And two people are dead after a woman steals an ambulance and crashes it into a semi-trailer truck in California. Local media reports that the woman hijacked the ambulance at knife point before crashing it into that truck. Look at that wreckage. She was killed in the accident. The driver of the truck was also killed. No personnel inside the ambulance, or no one was inside the ambulance other than the woman who stole it when it crashed.
Police just released new surveillance footage showing a hammer-wielding man attacking 2 police officers. The NYPD commissioner now praising both of those officers and how they handled the situation. You can see it right there. They approached the man identified as 30-year-old David Barrell, and that's when he pulled out a hammer and began attacking Officer Lauren O'Rourke, striking her about 3 times.
She was being attacked. The officer was on the radio attempting to get help while her partner, in the space of what we feel was about 3 seconds, made what I believe was the right decision.
The other officer shot and wounded Barrell. He's now stable. Police say the hammer was the same weapon used in 4 attacks this week. The fate of the convicted Boston bomber now rests in the hands of the jury. It's the same jury that found him guilty of killing 3 people and wounding more than 250 others 2 years ago at the Boston Marathon. Johar Tsarnaev faces life in prison or the death penalty.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
That was the line made famous, or infamous, I should say, by Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, talking about his time in the Obama White House, and joining us now to discuss the Amtrak crash and the whole question about funding and infrastructure and congressional appropriations. J.D. Hayworth, host of Newsmax Prime. Good to see you, J.D.
It is good to be with you both, and seeing Rahm brings back memories because we served together on the Ways and Means Committee, and Rahm, in truest fashion, it's not just the Obama administration, a standard tactic of the left. Never let a crisis go to waste, and they waste no time weighing in and impugning the worst of motives to people who are conservative. And you saw a textbook case of that yesterday.
Do you think it will backfire?
Yeah, I think it will. I think that in the final analysis, most people take a look at Amtrak, and federal subsidies are incredible to that organization. And quite frankly, as Florida Congressman John Mica mentioned, he's on the Transportation Committee. He said, look, we just don't trust Amtrak. We've given them millions of dollars for safety. It seems to be shortchanged. They use it for other needs they think are there for personnel, et cetera. And so even what we're using here, funds slashed by $262 million. Now, the whole lexicon being used even here, and not to in any way criticize our dear friends who helped produce this, but this is part and parcel of the groupthink that always goes into effect. It's never money saved, it's always funds
And what they
slashed.
voted to do yesterday, too, was a vote in a committee. It was not a final vote. The funds were not actually being slashed. It was a vote in that
But
committee.
even, look, it never ceases to amaze me. Even here where, surprise, surprise, we lean rightward, we're in an editorial meeting for Newsmax Prime yesterday, and the groupthink was instinctively, oh, our infrastructure is just horrible.
And I suggested earlier, we were talking to Ford O'Connell, that maybe folks who ride the train, if they want improvements, might have to pay more for tickets. Why should the rest of America, the rest of taxpayers who don't use that service, subsidize?
We're already subsidizing it, and believe me, this is another thing that happens. There's like a collective amnesia. Historically, Mr. Obama came into office wanting $800 billion for stimulus. You know what got stimulated? They feathered the nest of the labor bosses and the people who supported him. All that money that could have gone to infrastructure never got there. And then the dominant media culture is acting like, well, there's no money for infrastructure. It was spent to the tune of almost $1 trillion, 5 years ago?
We also have had discussions from Bob Corker in the Senate talking about raising the gasoline tax to pay for infrastructure. What do you think about that move now? Do you think we'll hear more discussion
You
about
got to
that?
understand, and this is very interesting. I don't want to get too inside baseball, but John Kasich, now the governor of Ohio, when he chaired the budget committee, we wanted to take a look at a more equitable system that goes back to what you're talking about, because some states, such as Arizona, state I represented in Congress, we were a donor state. For every dollar we sent in the gasoline tax, we were getting back about 90 cents. So it wasn't working for us. There has to be a more equitable way of funding transportation, and we basically wanted those funds allocated to those regions to stay there, rather than seeing what we're doing with Amtrak, where we all pay in and it benefits the folks in the Northeast. But please, this is in no way to denigrate the extent of the tragedy. Quite the contrary. It's to point out all the political machinations involved in it.
And that's why I wanted to have you on here to discuss with us. We also want to talk about a story you've been following very closely, and that is the story of Sister Diana, who testified in Congress yesterday. You covered this in a great deal on Newsmax Prime. Give us an update on what's going on.
Well, Sister Diana spoke in front of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and gave an emotional accounting of what transpired. Mosul, you have to understand, is the Old Testament city of Nineveh, where Jonah, when you read about Jonah and the great fish, that's where Jonah was asked to go, and he had his own ideas and tried to disobey God and all the ensuing difficulties there. And to see what has happened to the Christian community, really the birthplace of the faith, that happened, on the timeline, at least a half century before the birth of Muhammad. To see what is happening to Christians there is tough, but a big shout out to Newsmax viewers who responded to our call to action to do something.
A lot of people are crediting you for helping make that happen.
Tell you what, JD, we also want to talk about Hillary's silence, deafening.
2 words: smart politics.
But we're going to ask you to stick around. We got a
that.
commercial break coming up here in about 20 seconds. But we want to get to your thoughts on this as well, because it's becoming more of an issue. Ford O'Connell reminded us it's been 24 days since she made a comment, 31 days since she answered any questions. JD will answer some
Who's
questions.
keeping
I'm
track?
always happy to talk. We'll be back with that.